Welcome to the IT Fundamentals Training Series. This is episode 37, and today we're going to talk about different types of operating systems. You would think that they were all one, but they're not. Join us. Welcome to episode 37 of the IT Fundamentals Training Series. I am your host, Mark Haupt, and today we're going to talk about types of operating systems. Now, you would think that they're all one, but they're not, and there's a number of different kinds that we'll go over. So first of all, we're going to talk about workstation operating systems. Now, workstations, remember, are the computers, the endpoint devices in which you and I utilize to access other systems. So as compared to a server that is serving up information like a file server or a web server or a database server. The workstations are where the endpoint work gets done. Now, there are a couple of different kinds of endpoint workstations. The first one they start off with here is Linux. There are Linux operating systems that are used for workstations. Very, very few people use them. Some of them do have graphical user interfaces or images on the screen. In fact, many of them do these days. But the most efficient use of a Linux system, whether it's server or a workstation, is through command line interface. So there are 4 different OSs that we're going to cover here. And Linux is that least popular one, and they admit that there in the books. In fact, those are their words. So why even talk about Linux operating system? Because at the server level, it is influential, and it is also at the heart of the Apple iOS. So the Linux operating system, the things you need to know about are in regards to the core and the kernel of that operating system. So some terms, if you will. I told you at the very beginning that terms are absolutely important. And what you need to learn here are the terms that are used for the testing. So daemons or daemons, most people call it daemons, DAEMONS, are services. That's the equivalent term under Windows is services. The shell or shell utilities, those are the desktop environments that the graphical user interface, for example, runs inside of. And then they have various desktop shell utilities as well. And those are the applications. So those are some important pieces that you need to know about the Linux, being that it is the least used of the workstation side of things. Typically, a Linux workstation would be used for a high-end system. For example, maybe in a physical security operations center, or a general security operations center would use the Linux operating system in order to command line and perhaps even hack back against attackers that are coming in. Perhaps a command line or Linux-based system would be utilized to act as an endpoint interface into a mainframe or into another server type of system where the operating system on that server is also Linux. Linux endpoints are also used in building management systems and services like that. So if you're going to be using Linux, you're probably going to be using it for some sort of very specific purpose. More than likely, you're going to find that the Linux desktop that they're utilizing is called Ubuntu, or as they call it in Figure 4.5, Lubuntu. And what that does, you'll notice in looking at 4.5 there that the graphical interface is very much like if you've ever seen an Apple operating system in its early stages. And like I said, the Apple iOS gets a lot of its background from that space there. So there's a number of different types of Linux versions, and another advantage of Linux is something called open source. Now, open source is typically something that is free for you to download and utilize. However, there's a number of companies out there that have taken open source and they have added their own layers. They have configured or specialized configurations or added their own code to it, which makes the open source turn into a paid for service. So be careful when you're downloading Linux versions, because you may think it's an open source, but then turn around and find out that there is a paid for piece of that application, perhaps a module or something that you can't utilize without making payment to. But even at the payment level, typically the Linux or the Linux workstations are fairly cheap. But that open source is another piece that you need to utilize, or you need to think about from the perspective of a a term that you need to understand. So open source means that it's been developed in an open environment and is frequently free. So let's kind of dive down on that a little bit. So the open source meaning, when we talk about developed in an open environment, means it's typically done in a collaborative effort, kind of like at an academic institution like a university. That's a result of an effort by a class, or you know how there's crowdfunding out there where a whole bunch of people put money in order to pay for a particular type of prospective service, or even provide assistance to people who need it. Well, open source is kind of it is actually the original crowdfunding type of scenario, where perhaps there's a whole bunch of people that are working on the code and they all put it together in an open format where anybody can join in and anybody can operate within that. And again, typically true open source is free for you to download, because what they want you to do is they want you to download the source code so you can sit there and play with it and add things to it, and then upload that in, so the changes you make, so that it can then become part of the next version. So these two words together, open, meaning anybody can operate on it, and source being related to the source code, the base code inside the operating system that we talked about earlier. So those are some things to keep in mind and consider there. But Ubuntu will be your most prolific version, if you will, of the workstation. There's other versions there that they mention is Linux Mint, Debian, KDE, or Red Hat. I can talk to you about SCO Linux, or Southern California Operating System Linux. That's a version of Linux that I learned on back in the early 1990s, and that was open source because it was developed at Southern California University, and then was further utilized by folks there. So, all right, so moving on. So on page 187, we talk about Mac. The Apple introduced the Macintosh computer in 1984, and behind the massive marketing campaign, it became popular. So we understand that, and it was the Mac OS versions of that were kind of layered on top of Linux, or at least got their start. If you go into the back end of iOS right now, it's very Linux-like. So there's a whole bunch of versions of the Mac OS, and you can see those in table 4.1 and 4.2. And the book just kind of talks about the various versions leading up. Now, I'm going to tell you that you do not need to know all the various versions of the Mac OS and the time frame in which they were released and things along those lines. What you do need to know about is probably the Mac OS X versions, and know that Mac, they code name there. So like the 10.8 version is called Mountain Lion, and 10.13, which was released in 2017, is called High Sierra, and so on and so forth. You know, Mac usage is very tuned towards creative type of functions. So sound studios, developers that do graphical type of presentations using Photoshop and other different graphics types of programs are very well tuned for the Apple iOS, and that's in part because the Linux base code that's on that is very, very streamlined and utilizes the kernel aspect of the computer very efficiently. So that's the important piece. Windows, everybody knows and loves Windows. Do I need to talk anything more about Windows other than from the testing purposes? You know, again, it goes through the Windows versions, the various versions, 3.11, the Windows 95, which was an absolute disaster. You know, and it goes up through Windows 10. So if you are currently using a Windows 11 system, keep in mind that the testing purposes, this goes through Windows 10, and you will have additional testing probably regarding the various versions of Windows, because this book really kind of focuses on that. So the Windows is the most utilized version that's out there, and it is what's on 90 some odd percent, actually high 90s% of computers that are out in the market today. Do note that Microsoft skipped Windows 9. There is no such thing as a Windows 9. So 7, 8, 10, and 11. So keep that in the back of your head. If there's a question there that might be a trick question in Windows 9, blah, blah, blah. Well, the answer is nothing. All right, some of the newer OSs that you want to take a look at are Chrome OS. These are going on Chromebooks. Google is the sole creator of that. That is their operating system. And again, it's somewhat based off of Linux type of format, although they will very much tell you that it is a whole brand new operating system. They really tried to get people to accept it. They were giving Chromebooks away in schools, trying to get it so that an endpoint workstation laptop that was running Chrome OS, is everything would be running off the cloud. Almost nothing would be saved onto the computer. The book does identify that it's the Gen 2 Linux kernel that's part of and packaged into the management system with Chrome. So that's probably something to keep in mind as well. And then the various Chrome OS versions out there. All right, so moving on to server operating systems. Again, what we've got here is essentially a replication of what we already talked about. You have Linux-based server systems. Now, server-wise, Linux is a very efficient operating system, especially when it's tuned specifically to a particular type of application that's layered on top of it. So if it's being acted as a web server and has Tomcat or Apache on top of that, it is a highly efficient workstation, or highly efficient server, if you will. Database clients, things along those pieces as well, are very, very efficient on Linux. Although Windows is still the most prolific, the most produced out there version of servers, Linux has much more of the market than on the workstation side of things. And that's a very important piece to understand. Apple tried to produce servers for a long while, and they've pretty much failed on that. Although there's still a few of them that are out there. You could see on page 198 that the paragraph about that is about 7 lines long. That will tell you about how important it is to know. Just know it exists, know that they are out there, and that they were highly tuned towards things like Apple TV or servers that were along those lines in businesses and schools and individual homes. Apple iOS, Apple servers were really trying to make an inroad inside of a home where they could download, things like off of iTunes and have a distributed, a localized module, if you will. And it really didn't take off. Windows, of course, Windows is the largest operating system, although there's just a little bitty paragraph here about it. The way the Windows operates, Windows Server operates, we need to know that there are certain versions of it. It goes up to 2019 is the biggest operating version, 2016 and 2019 right now. Anything 2012 and before is deprecated or not being serviced at this point, or pretty close to it. And it just works. It does a great job in operating out there. And then there's mobile operating systems. They identify Apple iOS again, and Android operating systems. We all are very familiar with those. Just read the book on that, and you'll know what you need to know about that. If you want something just for the fun of it, read the real world scenario, who's really number one, and the debate on there of who is number one, Android or iOS, and so on and so forth. So the one thing I will point out is on page 203, they talk about Windows Mobile, dead, done, and gone. That thing died a painful death along with their Windows Phone. You could see on table 4.6, they had Windows Phone 7, 8, 8.1, and then they went to Windows 10 Mobile, where they were trying to break away from utilizing an actual Windows Phone, but were able to put the mobile onto another type of phone. That didn't work either, and that's pretty much a dead, done, and gone. Now, we're going to stop there and take a look at virtual operating systems in episode 38, because those are a little bit more in-depth and important to take a look at. So I hope you've had a good overview. I know it's a breeze through because a lot of us are very familiar with these operating systems. If there's one of them that you're not familiar with, from a workstation endpoint perspective, dive in, take a look at it a little closer. And if you need some help with taking a look at like you've never seen a Linux-based or perhaps an Apple-based iOS, let me know, and I could probably put you in touch with somebody that can help you out and take a look at that. So again, get a hold of us. This is episode 38, and you can contact me at mhaupt@commonsensesecurity.net. Look forward to it. Talk to you later.